Why are we here? According to Zechariah Stitchin in the 12th Planet, the Hebrew people of the Bible were predated by an earlier civilization called the Sumerians. And the Sumerians left records on clay tablets in a cuneiform text in which they spoke about our origins. They said that we originated from a genetic manipulation by extraterrestrials who came to this planet around about 500,000 years ago with the intention of mining for gold. Initially they had permission to come here to the planet because the universe has safeguards to protect planets against what we saw in the Avatar movie of civilizations coming and plundering planet for resources and disturbing the indigenous peoples. And the extraterrestrials who wanted to mine for gold here, they were after gold, you see, had permission from the guardians of this planet, so long as they didn't interfere with the indigenous people. They could come and take what they wanted, and they had to clean up after themselves. And the main rule was they didn't, in fact, create any new species. So what originally happened, according to these Sumerian texts, was that the extraterrestrials came with their own workers, and they started to mine for gold in South Africa. But they didn't in fact land in South Africa, they landed in Mesopotamia between the river Tigris and Euphrates. And they established a base there in which they established a garden called Eden, and in that garden they had all sorts of fruiting trees that they brought in from elsewhere according to these texts, like almonds and grapes. And so it wasn't just where do we come from, it's where do a lot of food-bearing plants come from. And according to the Sumerian texts, they were actually introduced by these extraterrestrials as their own food source. So this garden in Mesopotamia was used by the extraterrestrials really for rest and recreation of their workers. But the actual work was done down in South Africa where the gold was located. And in fact, in South Africa, there's evidence of very old gold mines, very ancient workings down there. So all was going well, and they were extracting the gold and taking it off planet in their ships until there were climatic changes. And the climatic changes were caused by periodic pole shifts. So obviously a pole shift happened and it became a lot colder in South Africa and a lot more difficult for the workers in the mines. According to the Sumerian prediction, the Sumerian records, there were two leaders of the expedition. One was Enlil and the other was Enki. Now Enlil was younger, they were brothers, they were half-brothers actually, and Enlil was younger by years but more senior because his mother was a senior queen. They were princes, you see. Enki, the older brother, was junior in rank because his mother was a junior queen, and this created a difficult situation between the brothers. There was a tension between the brothers. Enki was a lot more experienced. He was a more humble man. He was a very, very experienced scientist, biological scientist, and also he was a geological scientist. He was the main scientist in the team. Enlil, his younger brother, was actually the boss. He was in charge of the operation. He was far more arrogant. He was far more cruel, and there was a lot of resentment from Enki over the way way Enlil lorded it over him. Now these extraterrestrials, they weren't mammals. They were basically reptilians. Okay. And this is why the climatic change produced problems, because they weren't, although they were the hominids, they weren't really adapted to harsh climatic conditions of the planet. And so Enki suggested to the Anunnaki, they were called the Anunnaki, these people, by the way, and Enki suggested to the Anunnaki bosses that were off-planet, that had given them permission to come here, that maybe they could produce a mule, they could produce some sort of hybrid between their own workers and mammalian hominids already on the planet. I don't know which hominid they worked with, but it was whoever was on the planet about 250,000 years ago, maybe Neanderthal man or one of those earlier forms of the human being. And apparently what they did is they did a genetic engineering where they spliced in their own genes either into the chromosomes of the terrestrial hominids, the mammalian hominids that were already on this planet, or the other way round. They may have brought in mammalian genes into their own chromosome, the chromosomes of their own bodies. One way or another, they produced a hybrid between their own workers and the mammals on the Earth. So they produced a reptilian mammalian cross. So this was Enki's responsibilities, and he had his laboratories down in Africa where he was actually producing batches of these new workers that were adapted. They were slaves basically, and they worked very successfully in the mines, but they were mules. They had no reproductive capability, and they would use their own females to actually birth these hybrids. So they were in vitro fertilizations. They were embryos generated in the lab and then planted into the wombs of the fertile extraterrestrial females, and the batches were produced. Now, what happened, according to these legends, and they are legends, I can't verify for their truth, but I think they're a fascinating story, a possibility of how we originated. According to these legends, Enlil decided that he wanted a batch of these mules to work in the garden, in the Eden garden up in Mesopotamia. And so instead of asking Enki for a batch of mules, which would have been quite reasonable, he rustled them. His attitude was he didn't have to ask Enki, he was the boss, and he would just take what he wanted. So anyway, he stole a batch of these workers and took them back to the garden and worked them in the garden. And this upset Enki. Enki was absolutely incensed, but there's nothing he could do about it because he was not the boss. Then, when those mules had died out, he had the audacity to ask Enki for another batch. Enki thought, I'm going to get my own back on this guy. I'm going to land him in the poo. So what he did is he produced a batch for his brother. But what he did is he switched on the reproductive potential. In other words, the batch of workers that were delivered to Enlil were not mules. They were fully sexually switched on workers, male and female. Thus, Homo sapiens were born. And this is the basis of the Adam and Eve story, you see. Because the people that were there before there were terrestrial precursors, there were sexually active terrestrial precursors of Homo sapiens, okay? And there were mules, there were non-reproductive precursors of us as well. But the true human being switched on sexually reproductive cross between the extraterrestrials who were created in the image and likeness of these gods and us as we are now. That, in other words, our origins were in this batch of sexually active workers that were delivered to Enlil. Well, all hell broke loose because Enlil was now responsible for this situation. Basically, the law had been broken. They were given permission to mine for gold so long as they did not produce a new species, so long as they didn't disturb the situation here. And of course the new species had been created, they were reproducing. It was like the androids were out of control. And so Enki actually represents the snake, the serpent in the Garden of Eden, because these were reptiles. And he spoke as though he knew the Lord's mind. The Lord, of course, was Enlil. And Enlil cast his brother in a very, very bad picture. You know, he was very, very upset and very angry. But it was Enlil who carried the responsibility of us. And so this has created a quite an interesting situation that you can really begin to understand the biblical history from this scenario, because there's confusion as to why, when you get the Noah story, for example, why one moment God wants to destroy us and then the next moment he wants to save us. Well, it's because it's not one God, it's a number of gods. You see, the early Bible said Elohim created us after our own image and likeness. The Elohim said, let us, create man. Let us create the heavens and the earth. Let us create man after our own image and likeness. That's why it's in the plural. It never was one God. It was a group of gods, pluralistic, you see. So what was happening was that one God was opposed to another, because from that point what happened is that Enlil exiled his brother. So his brother was out, you see. And also Enlil was in trouble as well. And both brothers have been exiled to this planet until they can sort this issue out. That's their punishment. They're on planet. They have to sort us out. And they can't leave this planet until this species is dealt with. That we're either destroyed or we are converted to our full divine potential as the gods, like them. And so in the whole process of human history, it's involved with these two brothers. And in order the way we can understand the Bible is that Abraham, he was Abraham at the time when he was approached by Enlil, who was the older brother, you see. And this is where we get the monotheism, the one God scenario, because basically the older brother, Enlil, came to Abraham and said, you've got to follow me alone. Don't listen to the younger brother, you see. And Enki, the younger brother, then comes in and calls for people to follow him. So in these stories, Enlil fulfills the role of Jehovah in the Old Testament, and Enki fulfills the role of Jesus in the New Testament. You see, Enki created us. Enki loves us. We're his children. We're not the children of Enlil. In fact, what happened is this, as far as I'm concerned, and again, this is just my piece on it, is that in the Noah story, this was another climatic change, where tsunamis were sweeping over the surface of the earth. It could have been a drop in the basin of the Mediterranean. It could have been the Atlantean fall, the collapse of Atlantis at some stage in our history. But, there are a lot of records in many civilizations of a great inundation. What I'd like to do is really try to make sense of the Bible in terms of the genetic engineering of our species by these extraterrestrials that were described in the Sumerian texts as Enki and Enlil. You see, it makes a lot of sense of the book of Genesis. In the book of Genesis, in the original Hebrew texts, it was never Lord and God. The word God actually comes from the King James Bible. It's an Anglo-Saxon word. The original Hebrew texts, they spoke of the Elohim. The Elohim literally means the gods. It's plural. It's Hebrew plural for God. It's the gods. So there's no case for monotheism in the original Bible. And if you're going to believe the Bible is the Word of God, you really should believe the original texts from which modern translations are derived over modern translations. So we're dealing with a polytheistic religion, the early Hebrew religion, and it's based on an earlier legends which come from an earlier civilization, the Sumerians. Okay? So this is where we get the Enlil and Enki stories from. So the story of the Garden of Eden is this garden in Mesopotamia where they had a rest and recreation center for the original workers. And the fact that it was like paradise is because there were so many beautiful foods that were brought in and trees brought in from other planets, including, according to the Sumerian texts, almonds, grapes. A lot of the fruits that we enjoy were not on the planet before these extraterrestrials brought them in. And a bit like here we are in New Zealand, where you've got gorse and all sorts of other plants, that have been brought in by the English settlers. Well, it's the same. These extraterrestrials brought in their own plants. We all now enjoy. So the original Elohim were a group of reptilian extraterrestrials who bioengineered us out of their own stock for the purpose of mining gold in South Africa. And the genetic engineering was conducted by Enki, who was the younger member of the gods, the younger member of the Elohim team, and Enlil, his senior brother, not older, Enki was senior, the more senior brother, Enlil, had secured a batch of these hybrids that Enki had bioengineered for his garden, to work in his garden, and they'd been delivered from South Africa, from the laboratories in South Africa. And the reason why we became genetically switched on, and that is we came into the knowledge that is spoken of in the Bible, eating from the tree of knowledge, is because of the conflict between the two brothers. So the serpent in the Garden of Eden, when you actually read the story of the interview between Eve and the serpent is speaking as a friend. He's speaking the truth to Eve. So in a sense, the picture of him being the devil or being the demon has been painted by Enlil, the older brother, who was the lord of the Elohim and was the one who appeared as God. I have to correct myself again, it's not the older brother, it's the senior brother. So we're getting a situation where climatic changes are producing changes in the story. And the next big major climatic change spoken of in the Bible was the cause of the deluge of Noah. Again, it's very likely to have been a pole shift causing major tsunamis, causing lands to fall, lands to rise. This could have been the demise of Atlantis, or it could have been the formation of the Mediterranean basin, where lands simply slipped down and the sea and were inundated by the oceans. So we're not sure exactly what that inundation was, but there's a lot of evidence for there having been an inundation. And again, the confusion of why one moment God wants to destroy the species and the next moment he wants to save the species, it's because Enlil wants to destroy us and Enki wants to save us, because Enlil is the brother who basically inherited the problem, but our real father, the God who created us in the laboratories in Africa, the laboratories of creation, was Enki. And the thing about the Elohim is that there were more than two. There was a team of these reptilian gods, but and they split, the team split, so that there were a team working with Enki and a team working with Enlil. The thing about Enki and Enlil is that they were the princes. They were They were the senior members of this Elohim team of the gods. So, in terms of the Noah story, Enlil, well, in fact, all the Elohim, because they were scientists, they were in the know, they knew that the climatic changes were coming. They knew the pole shift was coming, and they knew that this would be destructive. And Enlil thought, great, this is an opportunity to get rid of this problem of the androids that are out of control. But it was Enki that came to Noah and, told him how to create the ark. And it's very likely he didn't have a lot of wild animals loose in the ark. In fact, according to the Sumerian legends, the ark was more like a floating laboratory where he had the germplasm, he had the, the genetic material, a bit like we'd have in a modern laboratory, where you get sperm banks and what have you. So maybe they had frozen embryos of different species, in the laboratory. But it's also, there's another possibility that was a more domesticated species, because if it was a local inundation of the Mediterranean, it wouldn't have affected elephants and giraffes in Africa and zebras. So I think this whole idea of, the Noah's Ark picture with little, that you see in the children's stories of giraffes and lions and things is quite unlikely. It's more like the ark was full of goats and sheep and pigs and such like. But that's just my speculation. We then move on in the Bible to the story of Abraham, and I think this is one of the most interesting stories in the Bible in respect to this legend of Enki and Enlil. Abram, as he was before he was renamed Abraham by his God, was a Sumerian. He was a citizen of the city of Ur, which was a Sumerian city. And what happened is that one of the Elohim appeared to him, and it would seem that it was in fact Enlil. It was the senior Elohim appeared to him. And up until that point, it had always been the gods. It had always been the team that were spoken of. And before we speak about Abraham, I've just missed one point I'd like to go back to, and that is the dispersion at the time of Babylon. It would seem that different groups of human beings went off in different directions. After the flood of Noah, obviously before the flood, the human species had reproduced and established themselves as a highly organized civilization. So this sounds like the story of Atlantis, the fall of Atlantis, a very well organized advanced civilization disappearing in some sort of change, rather like, the anticipated pole shift. Then after the inundation, we get the peoples re-establishing themselves in the area of Iraq, and they build a city, they establish civilization again, and there's some sort of dispersion of where the people are taken away to different areas of the planet. And again, it's fascinating story, this, because there is anthropological evidence that our DNA originates from a very small group of people, and that there has been a dispersion of people around the planet from a relatively small core group. So it could have been that each group was taken away, and I believe they would have been shipped off like cattle by one member of the Elohim team. So it could have been a dispersal of the Elohim team as well as the people. So you get, the Chinese people, you get the people in India with their own gods, with their own legends. And what's interesting is that with all of these people, you still get the same pattern of the serpent. The serpent appears everywhere, and the serpent represents the Elohim gods. For example, the Chinese goddess Kuan Yin rides on the back of a serpent. the serpent, the dragon, is the symbol of the Chinese people. So the next stage of this story, after this dispersion in the book of Genesis, is the story of Abraham, who then got renamed Abraham. Now, Abraham was a Sumerian. He was a citizen of the city of Ur when one of the Elohim gods appeared to him. And it seems likely that it was Enlil, that is the senior brother, who actually came to Abraham. And what he asked of Abraham was fidelity. And he asked Abraham to worship him alone. And in return for worship of him alone, he promised Abraham all the earth for his progeny. And at the time, Abraham had only one son, and that was Ishmael, his son by a serving woman called Hagar. She was like a lady in waiting to his wife Sarah, one of Sarah's maids. And Sarah had allowed for this conception because Sarah was barren. And so Abraham was rather perplexed by this promise of children because he had a barren wife, and they were getting on in years. They were past childbearing. Certainly his wife was past childbearing age and had never borne him any children, Sarah. And so this is where monotheism originates from. It originates from this meeting of Abraham and, I believe, Enlil, the Sumerian god Enlil. And the fact that Abraham was comfortable with this meeting, it's as though he recognized the god, which is why I believe it was one of the Sumerian gods, because he was obviously brought up in the tradition of Enlil and Enki. So he left Ur. He went out into the wilderness with his people, with his family group, and he was renamed Abraham. And there's the story of his being called upon to offer up one of his sons for sacrifice. And I'm convinced it was in fact Ishmael, his first son, because in the Bible story it says, the angels spoke to him and said, offer your son, your only son. So the only time Abraham had an only son was when he had Ishmael. And the thing is that when you actually read the Bible carefully, one moment it's God speaking, next moment it's an angel speaking. And angels are messengers. They are these beings that descend from the skies. So again, I'm convinced that the angels are extraterrestrials. So this figures with, the story of like with the dispersion in Babylon, the God saying, let us descend to the earth. You see, they come down from the heavens to the earth. So, in terms of the origin of the lineage of humanity, of these genetic lines...
May I interrupt you?
Yeah.
Why did this Lord want an offering of another human being?
This is a very interesting thing. I mean, why did he want blood sacrifice? I think it's because he wanted to test the faith of Abraham. Abraham was pretty short on sons because, his wife was barren. And obviously it was an issue to him. He really wanted a child, which is why Sarah would have allowed him to have conceived a child with Hagar. And it may have been a cause of a certain amount of tension that he only managed to get one son with one serving girl. So Ishmael must have been very, very precious to him. And so being asked to sacrifice Ishmael would have been a massive sacrifice for Abraham and a test of his faith to this God. So, I've always admired Abraham for that act of devotion, act of faith. But the thing is that...
Why did you admire him for that? Because
I admired simply because it was a very, very harsh request.
Yeah, but why would you... Why... He only did it so that he would be rewarded. That's why he did it.
Well, yes, there's certainly that aspect to it. I mean, I have my reservations about this God that was appearing, this one God that was appearing to Abraham, because he's asking for blood sacrifice, which, you know, is more demonic. He sounds more like a demon. He doesn't sound a very nice character at all. And also, I've got very considerable reservations about his intentions, in that he's tempting. You know, he tempted Abraham. He said, look, if you do what I say, if you worship me and me alone, I will give you all the kingdoms of the earth. You know, I will give, not to you personally, but to your children. You'll have many children, and they will be, they will spread throughout the world, and they will rule the world. They will dominate the world, you see. So, to me, it's cutting a deal, really. And, you know, Abraham was happy enough to worship this God in return for that promise. But even so, I still think that it takes a lot of trust in the promise to actually go through with that sacrifice. And as it was, he didn't sacrifice his son, because the extraterrestrial appeared to him, and immediately, as he was about to bring the knife down on his son, who I believe to be Ishmael, who was the father of the Muslims, by the way, not the Jews, fathers of the Arab people, not the Hebrew people. His hand was stayed, and there was a ram caught in the bushes, and the ram was offered up instead. But in the Genesis story, what is interesting in terms of the bioengineering of humanity is that Enlil appeared to Abraham, and he was in his tents. He was like a Bedouin at the time, and said to him that his wife Sarah, who was old and barren, was going to bear him a child, and this child was going to be the special one, was going to be the, was going to be the father of his chosen people. And Sarah overheard this conversation, and, you know, in her mind it was like, this is crazy. Who's this dude that's appearing to my husband and telling him ludicrous things like this, that I'm going to be having a child? I'm old, I'm barren. And this being that appeared to Abraham obviously had telepathic powers, because he picked up what Sarah was thinking and said to Abraham, you know, I'll prove your wife wrong. She will bear a child. So the next thing is that Abraham's wife Sarah becomes pregnant in her old age. She's in her 80s. Now, I believe what happened was that Enlil decided he was going to take a leaf out of his brother Enki's book. I think he'd been swatting up a bit on genetic engineering himself. And I reckon what he did was an embryo implant on Sarah. I believe that Abraham had only one son. The interesting thing is that Abraham was called on to offer his son, his only son, on Mount Moriah, which is now the Temple Mount of Jerusalem, after Isaac was born. So again, there's this whole issue about the only son. Abraham had an only son. There were two boys there. But why did the angel say, your son, your only son? He repeated it twice. It's because it's the truth. Abraham had only one son. The son of Abraham is Ishmael. Isaac, I believe, was not the son of Abraham. Isaac was the son of God. He was the son of Enlil. I believe that what happened is Enlil did a bit of gene splicing, okay, and created, out of Sarah's seed, he planted his chromosomes, he planted his genetics into Sarah's seed, and created an embryo in vitro in the laboratory, planted it in her womb, using, as we would these days, you know, you can get old women to carry children if you give them the right hormones. She just had hormone therapy. And away she went and bore the child. And this is why the chosen people, this is why you get these bloodlines, you know, linked with the Hebrew people, the Jewish people. Their God kept coming back and saying, you're my chosen people. I'm your father. You see, Enlil was the father of the Jewish people. Truly the father. It wasn't Abraham, you see. An amazing story. This is why this whole thing about genetic engineering makes sense of the Bible. Without genetic engineering and hormone therapy, without the knowledge we have in science today, it doesn't make sense. But
now, let me ask you. The question was, why are we here? How does what you've just said fit into that answer? Why are we? There's a bigger, more divine picture to everything. So this is what's happened on the third dimensional level. What is the bigger picture? Why are we here? What are we to learn from this?
Well, the way I perceive it is, again, I just have to pass on what I understand. I can't say this is absolutely the way it was, but I try to make sense of some of these ancient stories to really understand why we are here, and understand the backdrop of what's going on with these extraterrestrials and their intervention. We've got to go a lot further back. We've got to actually look at the ancient Vedic scriptures. Now, in the ancient Vedic scriptures, Enlil and Enki figure, but they figure with different names. So you get the same story, but you get different names in different cultures. In the Indian, ancient Indian Vedic legends, the two brothers, the two princes, were called the Kumaras. Kumara is Sanskrit for prince. And their names were Sanat and Sananda Kumara. And the thing is that Sanat is the senior of these brothers, of these princes, so he fits with Enlil. And Sananda is the junior, and he fits with Enki. Okay. And the interesting thing is, in terms of our issue, if Sanat Kumara is Enlil, and if Enlil is the God of Abraham, then he's Jehovah, the God of the Old Testament. Okay? So, what I've discovered in my research is that Sananda Kumara is actually Michael the Archangel, who is also Jesus Christ, because according to the Seventh-day Adventists and the Jehovah's Witnesses, Jesus was an incarnation of Michael the Archangel from their analysis of the Bible, and I support that. But he's also an incarnation of Sananda. So we get Enki is the name for this person or this being in the Sumerian culture, Sananda in the Vedic, Michael in the Hebrew, but it's the same, extraterrestrial. Okay. So if we now go, and Enlil is Jehovah, and he's also Sanat. Okay, but I believe the word Satan is an anagram of Sanat's name. That's where I think that name Satan comes from. It's a name that crops up. It's like, where does it come from? Why Satan? Why not Santa? You see. And I believe that Enlil is working with that name as a cover. And that name has a very dark frequency about it. It's a very dark, very negative energy. So,
but if that has a very dark frequency, then Jesus would have a very dark frequency as well.
Well, I think what I need to do is go back further still, go right back to the beginning, then we can begin to understand, because one of the issues is we have a lot of judgments, we human beings. And one of the things Jesus said in his stories is, don't judge. We're not in a position to judge. And I believe none of these beings were really evil. I believe that they were simply playing a part, because we have to have the duality of the light and the dark in order to have any form of evolution. If we go to the Vedic scriptures, this is their story. According to the Vedic scriptures, in the beginning there was Brahma, the creator. And Brahma had created the first galaxy, the first little universe. Okay? And he had 4 sons, Sanat Kumara, Sananda Kumara, and two others that I don't need to mention because they don't. I just want to keep it simple to the two names. And he asked these sons to go out and establish life, biological life, in the galaxy, to set up the templates of DNA and RNA, and they refused. And so he asked them a second time. He said, look, sons, this is what I've created you for. This is what I've trained you for. You've been trained in working with crystals, because the precursors of DNA and RNA were crystals, using resonance to bring the templates for the laser light of consciousness to come through into the different layers, the matrices of multidimensional living organisms on the different planes. And again they refused. A third time Brahma called on his sons, "Sons, I've created you for the purpose of creating life in the galaxy. Go forth and do what I've asked you to do." A third time they refused. An emotion hitherto...
Were these reptilians?
No, this was way before that. These were spirits. These weren't in bodies at this stage. Okay, right back at the beginning. They hadn't even produced DNA and RNA at this stage. Okay. A third time these spirits refused. And an emotion hitherto unknown to Brahma rose up from his heart and exploded out of his forehead. This emotion was rage, fury, Rudra, red, the rage. Thus Shiva was born. Shiva exploded out of the forehead of Brahma, the big stick, and he drove those four sons out of heaven, out of the presence of Brahma, out of the presence of the Father, into the cold and the dark and the unknown of the galaxy. And those boys suffered. It's like, sons being kicked out of the home, kicked out of the nest, out into the wide world to make their own way, you see. And obviously they were suffering because of this, because they felt they'd blown it with Dad, and they thought that they'd never experienced the darkness and the cold and the unknown. They were in uncharted waters. But they got down to the job, and over eons they created the templates of life, established the templates of life, and got on with the whole evolutionary process, because life is created through evolution, through a process called DNA resonance, where you're actually using the DNA molecule like the coil in a radio set for getting information from higher levels of the universe in. And you're learning by experience. That's where Darwin's theory of evolution is so brilliant, the whole concept of natural selection, testing systems. You try them out, and if they don't work, you then, try something different. But there's intelligence behind the evolutionary process. And so anyway, we're now moving forward. The four sons have obviously made up with Dad that there's no way that they were thrown out of heaven forever. That's a ludicrous idea. And also this whole idea that just the eldest brother, Lucifer, was thrown out of heaven, again is wrong. They were all thrown out of heaven by Shiva. The creation of Shiva, he was the Rudra, the rage. He drove them all out of heaven, you see. And that produced a problem. The creation of Shiva, anger, rage, produced a problem in the universe, because as fast as Brahma created, Shiva would destroy. And thus you get the balance, which is Vishnu, the preserver. And it's interesting because Vishnu is the precursor of the energy of Krishna, who is much more loving, much more compassionate. And we see this sort of Vishnu, compassionate energy coming through in Buddha, in Jesus Christ, in a lot of these great spiritual teachers. It seems to be this preserver energy, the balance between creation and destruction. Okay. But again, this whole issue with human beings of us having to cope with anger, with Rudra and rage, and not allowing ourselves to be carried away by rage, is trying to heal this issue of Shiva. We're resolving the Shiva dilemma of not resorting to anger and destruction and fury and rage and war. We've got to work this out as part of so again, why are we here? It's partly to work out this issue of dealing with the anger of God, dealing with this anger of Brahma. Okay. So what I want to do now is move forward. We've got the situation of where the four brothers have fulfilled the purpose of their evolution, but we've got Shiva charging around the universe, destroying as fast as Brahma creates, with Vishnu, the preserver, holding those two opposing forces of creation and destruction apart. And we've now got a situation of where the galaxies themselves have been expanding, so that the universe is expanding, there are more galaxies, and a problem arose. If you read a book called The Intelligent Universe by Professor Sir Fred Hoyle, you know, he was one time president of the Royal Society, one of Britain's greatest cosmologists, if not the greatest. He spoke about the universe being intelligent, and he said he didn't like the idea of a God that created the universe. He liked the idea of the gods, which correspond to the Elohim, as managers in an already created universe. And I think Fred Hoyle's perspective of creation is far more accurate in terms of the early Bible than what's taught at Sunday school. Okay? And according to Fred Hoyle's cosmology, we would see these brothers as the managers in the already existing universe, the gods, the Elohim. And the thing is that their ability as managers has never been surpassed. And this is a problem for the universe, because the quality of management of the galaxies had been basically wasn't as good as it could be. And the reason is because the original Elohim, the original brothers, went through incredible difficulty, challenge and adversity. It was a bit like Christopher Columbus sailing the Atlantic. It was terrifying, it was frightening. Everyone believed that the earth was flat, that they'd sail off the end and be lost. Whereas once he'd discovered America, for everyone who followed, it was easy, the way was charted, you see. So the four brothers were called in again by Brahma, and Brahma put this problem to them. He said, look, chaps, he said, I've got another problem, and that is the spirits that you're producing, because it's the Elohim who create the spirits, you see. It's like their children and their children's children. There's a lineage of creation of angels by archangels, if you see. So the Elohim correspond to archangels, Lucifer and Michael, etc. The problem Brahma put to them is that the angels they were producing were not, the spirits they were producing were not up to standard. And he said to them, you've got to bring these guys up to standard. I want management in the universe as good as you. Enter planet Earth. What the Elohim decided to do was to find a planet and use it as a flight simulator for pilots of consciousness. In other words, their plan was to set up on the planet a scenario of difficulty, challenge and adversity, fear, terror, that they had gone through, because they realized that it's only through challenge and adversity and suffering that spirits evolve. And so it would seem that, this whole story of the Sumerian story of, which is put forward in the 12th Planet by Zachariah Stitchin, it's just a front, it's just a cover. It's not that at all. The whole business of mining for gold, it's just a front, it's just a cover. It's not that at all.
Or maybe it's that on a micro level.
Oh yeah.
As we have the macro level, the sort of spirit level,
yeah.
There's also a manifestation on a third dimensional
level. Yes. I mean, basically these brothers had to produce a scenario which fitted the bill. In other words, they didn't want us to suss what's going on. It's only now at the end of ages that we can begin to appreciate the true story. Okay, because everything we're taught in Sunday school and in history and what have you is kind of like, well, nearly there, but it's not really the way things were. So this whole situation of the duality between the two brothers, the conflict, which is like the good and the bad, between Enlil and Enki, between Sanat acting as Satan and Sananda acting as Jesus. You know, when you read The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, you get his brilliant description of the Old Testament God. He's an absolute moron. He's a monster. He's a beast. He's a Gaian. He's a tyrant. He's a terrible, vengeful, judgmental God. And you know, there are a lot of schools of thought that believe the Old Testament God is Satan. The Cathars, for instance, taught the Old Testament God is Satan. William Blake believed it. But he didn't believe in Satan being an absolute nasty, but really as a lesser god, a demiurge. This was the Gnostic belief. And in fact, John the Divine, even in St. John's Gospel, it says, you know, Jesus accuses the Jews and says to them that their father is the devil. So in other words, the father of the Jewish people, going back to the Abraham story, was not Abraham, but was Sanat Kumara, alias Satan. Now, I'm of Jewish blood, so I'm pointing at myself, all right, because it's quite an accusation. But, you know, it makes so much sense. I mean, when you take it, you know, in the Jewish race, the brilliance of the Jewish people, you know, all the great composers and artists and scientists, Einstein, Newton, you know, great pianists and what have you, like Chopin, Jewish, you see. So there's this brilliance that comes through from Sanat Kumara, and I think that was his plan with the chosen people, was to give them a cut of his intelligence, of his brilliance, so that they would be the superior people. And he was setting up for this scenario of creating a situation, a tension, that would bring the world into the sort of difficulties and challenges that we've experienced in the 20th century. So the idea is that we are spiritual beings here having a physical experience, but in our genetic makeup has been scrambled deliberately. The DNA has been scrambled in the laboratories of creation. The Elohim did a bit of genetic engineering. They used resonance and they actually broke the membranes that were holding the DNA. The 12-strand DNA is 12 strands of the chromosomes. It's not the DNA molecule being 12 strands. That can only ever be 2 strands. But it's the chromosomes are organized in tetrahedrons, a 2-star tetrahedron, like the Star of David, like the spindle. You see these diamond-shaped structures, these membranes, you know, where the chromosomes are organized in the spindle before the splitting of the cell. You see, so, but the original structure of the DNA, the 12-strand DNA, of where the chromosomes are organized into a tetrahedron shape within the nucleus, held there by the membranes, would enable the chromosomes, these tetrahedrons, they're stargates, they would resonate with the Merkaba, the fifth dimensional light body, which is tetrahedron in shape. And what happened is that the membrane structure was broken down in the laboratories of creation to cut off our direct connection with the Merkaba, which is the spirit body, okay, the fifth dimensional spirit body. And this is where we moved into amnesia, moved into a state of not only forgetting we are God, but actually forgetting that there is a God, the state that we're in now. So this was deliberate, and it was necessary to actually create this scenario. I mean, dare I say it, I was in those laboratories of creation at the time, was involved in the decision making, was one of the leading lobbyists for this state of amnesia, for the state of the disruption of the 12-strand tetrahedral structure of the DNA, so that we could go into a state of forgetfulness, of amnesia, so that this scenario could be for real, so that we could really go through the challenge of separation, which is where the word sin comes from. So if you like, this was the original sin, which the serpent set up. And it was necessary. It was necessary for us to come into the knowledge of good and evil. You see, to experience evil as well as good. And so, because we had to go through the fear, the terror, make all the mistakes. It's like in the world at the moment. Look at all the mistakes we're making, but they're all part of this divine plan, you see, for us to become gods, so that we can be better managers of the universe.
Why are we doing such a bad job at it at the moment?
We're not. We're doing an absolute brilliant job of it. We're here to make mistakes. We're here to stuff it up. There are teams on the other side who are actually pulling us in two opposite directions just to make it more challenging. No, humanity is doing absolutely brilliantly. Really recognizing that war is unacceptable. You see, the greatest danger to the universe is displayed in the movie Avatar. That's why it's such an important movie, of what we could do if we went in with military power to planets and just destroyed the indigenous people in order to take what we want. And that has to be prevented. We have to mature beyond that point and say, no, that is unacceptable behavior. So it's part of a maturation process. So we have to have the demons, we have to have the Satans, we have to have the Hitlers, because they're part of our growth process in this program of the boot camp, of going through difficulty, challenge and adversity. We've got to experience the ultimate of fear. People judge the burning of the witches. No, women went through that experience of being burnt alive as part of going through abject terror of torture. I mean, imagine having bombs dropped on you and all these terrible things that have happened to us, but they're happening to these physical vehicles, okay, in a protected situation. It's a flight simulator for pilots of consciousness. The Elohim really know what they're doing. So anyway, going back to this story, again, we need to pass beyond judgment, to make ascension. I think the lesson in all of this is that we have to go beyond judgment. We've got to stop judging good and evil. You know, it's obviously when you're in an SAS training camp, you know, the regimental sergeant majors, the people that are putting you through your paces are like demons out of hell. But when you're actually out on the field and you're in the firing line, you're on the front line, you're really grateful for the training you've received. And so it is, we're not making a stuff up on this planet at all. Because of the climate change, because of the pole shift that's coming, all the tropical rainforests are going to be destroyed anyway by the pole shift. They're going to be in a different place. So it doesn't matter. This is why the timing of this lesson that we're going through at the hands of people like Stalin and Hitler and what have you has been allowed in the 20th century. So it's all for our greater evolution, and this is where we have to learn compassion and forgiveness and stop judging each other. Everyone is on their own journey. It's not for us to decide on a person's evolution. It's to allow each person to unfold as they will, because they're all at different stages of evolution. And that is our opportunity, is to come from love and really learn from our Creator, Enki, Sananda, Jesus the Christ. The only way is love your neighbor, is be compassionate and caring to each other and forgive. And as Buddha said, enlightenment, which is not enlightenment for myself, but enlightenment for all beings, okay? Enlightenment comes through understanding. We need to understand why we are here.